Welcome to the deep dive. Today we've got quite something you've brought in. It's this 2008 YouTube interview. Joan Rivers, right?
Yeah, that's the one. It was on a show called Shrink Wrap, hosted by, well, a clinical psychologist.
Interesting angle. So, our mission today is really to kind of get under the skin of this interview, explore these big themes in her life, betrayal, how she saw herself, and maybe what fueled that very unique comedy style she had.
Exactly. We're not just looking at the jokes here. It's about, understanding the person behind the persona.
Right.
The interview goes into some really deep stuff, her career ups and downs, that whole thing with Johnny Carson,
Well, yeah, that was huge.
huge, and the tragic suicide of her husband, Edgar Rosenberg, her relationships, her struggles with body image. It's all in there. And having a psychologist asking the questions gives it this different layer.
Definitely. And for everyone listening, we're hoping to pull out some real insights here about resilience, maybe?
Yeah, resilience is a big one.
And how family stuff early on can shape things, and how personal struggles can, feed into your public life, your work.
Absolutely. And we should say, we'll be touching on some difficult topics, so we'll handle those with sensitivity. The aim is understanding, not judgment.
Okay, so let's dive in. The interview actually starts, maybe surprisingly, with her saying she's in a good mood.
Yeah, which she says is like really rare for her. Maybe every 7 to 10 years, she jokes.
Wow. So what's behind this good mood, according to her?
Well, she says her daughter Melissa is okay, her grandson is okay, and her work life is okay. Everything's just sort of stable at that moment.
It really shows how much her happiness was tied to her families, doesn't it?
Totally.
Yeah.
She even uses that phrase, you're only as happy as your least happy child.
That really hits home, especially knowing how close her and Melissa were eventually.
Right. It shows that connection, how dependent her own emotional state was on them being all right.
She also talks about her dogs, I noticed.
Oh, yeah, they sound incredibly important. Like her family in the East, she calls them, since Melissa was out West.
Companionship, right?
Definitely. Says they sleep with her, then makes a typical Joan crack about what happens if she gets lucky.
Yeah.
But, beneath the joke, it's clear they provide real comfort, real family connection day to day.
Especially with family far away, those bonds matter.
For sure. And speaking of getting lucky, she talks about dating at 74. What did you make of that?
It was revealing, wasn't it? She sounds genuinely amazed that men still found her, viable and attractive. There's a vulnerability there.
Right. And then, bam, the punchline.
Exactly. Switches right back to the joke. Sex is the same as it was at 20. Disgusting.
Classic Joan. Deflating any sentimentality.
But she does admit the feelings underneath the joy, the hurt that doesn't change with age. The humor feels like a shield, almost.
Yeah, or a way to process it all. That quick switch from surprise about being attractive to the self-deprecating joke. It's a pattern.
It really is. And then the conversation shifts, gets much heavier. Betrayal in romance.
Yeah, she talks about a really painful experience, a partner she lived with for 8 years.
This was about 7 years before the interview.
That's right. And it wasn't just cheating, was it? The details she gives. Taking other women to lunch, using his credit card on them, buying gifts.
It sounds so blatant.
Exactly. And her reaction was just absolute. Cut him off completely. Never spoke to him again. Done.
Wow, that suggests some very strong lines drawn around fidelity.
Absolutely. No gray areas there for her, it seems. Which kind of leads into the next theme, doesn't it? Betrayal in her career.
Right, she suggests it's almost baked into the comedy world.
Yeah, she describes it as totally cutthroat. You're exactly as good as your last show. No security.
Unlike her dad, the doctor, with a steady career.
Right. It's constant pressure, always the risk of just disappearing. Which really sets the scene for how she felt about Johnny Carson.
Okay, this is that huge defining moment people talk about. Walk us through her side of it.
So she had her own show. It was doing well, apparently even beating Carson in ratings sometimes. Her contract's up. She gets offered her own network show. Big deal.
Massive.
So she wants to tell Carson first. She calls him. He hangs up on her.
Just hangs up.
According to her, yes. She calls back. He hangs up again. And then the kicker is he tells the press she never called, never told him.
Oh, that's brutal.
Totally. And it apparently led to this huge backlash against her. She became kind of toxic for a while, professionally isolated. It really shows the power dynamics back then.
Yeah, how someone like Carson could control the narrative. That must have been incredibly damaging.
And isolating. Definitely highlights how fragile those relationships could be at that level. She also mentions another business betrayal, briefly.
Oh, yeah, the partner she called a slime bag.
That's the one. Apparently, he took her company public, floated a massive bond, like $100 million in today's money,
Yeah.
she guessed, and then just vanished with the cash.
Unbelievable.
And she admits, she wasn't great with business stuff, felt that made her vulnerable, maybe trusted the wrong people.
It seems like these experiences, personal and professional, really left scars. Which brings us to maybe the deepest wound Edgar's suicide. She doesn't call it betrayal initially, does she?
No, not at first. Her initial take seems focused on his pain, the business problems, the fight with Fox, depression after his heart surgery, his inability to work as a producer, which got their show canceled.
So she saw it as him being overwhelmed.
Yeah, like an act born out of agony, not directed at her or Melissa. She seems to be trying to understand his suffering first.
But then the interviewer brings up the idea of betrayal. How does that shift things?
Well, it clearly strikes a chord.
Yeah.
Because she immediately talks about the anger she still feels even, 17, 18 years later?
Wow. Still angry.
Yeah, and she recounts that awful sequence, him leaving the tapes for her, Melissa, a friend, to taking his life, and how Melissa found out.
Just horrific. A stranger on the phone.
Yeah. And Melissa's only 15. Has to tell her mom, who's in the hospital herself.
Yeah.
It's just devastating. Shows the trauma ripples outwards.
Absolutely. So what's the root of her anger towards Edgar still after all that time?
Yeah, it really sounds like profound abandonment. Feeling left completely alone to deal with the fallout. The ruins, she calls it.
Financial ruins, emotional ruins.
Everything. Financial mess, a traumatized daughter. She felt she had to handle it all alone, without him. And when she says she doesn't want to see him again in heaven, that tells you how deep that hurt still runs. It's incredibly raw.
And this obviously shattered her relationship with Melissa for a while.
Oh, completely. Melissa didn't speak to her for about a year, blamed her, even believed Joan was planning to leave Edgar anyway.
Which Joan denied.
Vehemently. It was therapy, eventually, that helped them reconnect. Melissa got to voice her anger. Joan got to say, look, I was doing the best I could in an impossible situation.
But Joan still felt Melissa might blame her, deep down.
Yeah, she suspected maybe some part of Melissa still held her responsible. Grief just complicates everything, doesn't it? Especially family bonds.
It really does. And Joan carried her own guilt, too, didn't she?
Oh, absolutely. Questioning if she could have stopped it. Should she have left him alone? Should she not have wanted space? All those what-ifs that torture survivors, that heavy, heavy self-blame.
Such a burden. Does she offer any advice for others who've lost someone to suicide?
Yeah, and it's quite direct. She basically says, it's okay to be angry. You're allowed to feel that anger towards the person. That's a huge validation, I think.
Definitely.
But then, crucially, she says, you have to go on. You have to move forward somehow. It's about survival, really. Rebuilding.
And how did she cope, personally, in the immediate aftermath?
Well, she talks openly about turning to food. Comfort eating, gaining weight.
Which connects to earlier issues.
Right. She mentions past struggles with bulimia, which apparently started around then, but she stopped because of the health risks. She sort of wonders if her mom used spending as a similar coping tool, maybe learned behavior.
Interesting parallel. And then in that really dark time, she actually considered suicide herself.
Yeah, that was a shocking admission. She felt completely overwhelmed. Lost Edgar, career was tanking, estranged from Melissa. She actually got a gun.
God, what stopped her?
It was her dog. Spike, her little Yorkie, came and sat on her lap, just sat there. And she felt, in that moment, that someone needed her. That simple connection, that little dog, it pulled her back.
Wow. That's incredibly powerful. A tiny dog saving her life.
It really is. A reminder of how vital connection is, in any form.
And during all this chaos, she was also dealing with her therapist dying.
Yeah, it's almost unbelievable timing, isn't it? Her therapist, Michael, was dying of AIDS. So the roles completely flipped. She ended up supporting him, caring for him, even though she desperately needed his support.
She was with him when he died.
Yes. Shows how close they were. The interviewer points out that must have felt like another kind of betrayal, almost. The one person she needed being taken away too.
Just layer upon layer of loss and difficulty.
Exactly. It's hard to fathom coping with all that simultaneously.
So the conversation eventually shifts again to something that seems like a constant thread throughout her life. Body image.
Oh, definitely. This feels really central for her. She says flat out, if I had a different body, I'd be a different person.
That's a huge statement.
Isn't it? She traces it back to childhood. Being a pretty baby, then becoming chubby, and feeling like she had to become the funny one to get attention, get love.
So maybe the comedy persona started partly as a coping mechanism for body image issues.
It certainly sounds like she saw a connection there.
Let's dig into the family dynamic a bit more. Her parents sound quite different.
Very. Her mom, formal, status conscious, lots of expectations about appearances and reflecting well on the family. Her dad, more relaxed, people-focused, the dedicated doctor.
And this has created some tension.
Seems like it. Especially around things like money, lifestyle. Joan seems to have really absorbed her mother's focus on appearance. So when reality didn't match, like not getting asked to dance, she took it as a personal failure, like she was betraying the ideal.
That's a heavy burden for a kid. And the idea comes up that maybe gaining weight was even a kind of defense against conflict or unhappiness.
Yeah, the interviewer floats that. And Joan herself admits she tends to gain weight when she's stressed or unhappy. Comfort eating, especially candy when she's nervous.
And she notes she eats more when depressed, unlike some people who lose their appetite.
Right. Suggests a really ingrained link between food, weight, and her emotional state.
Which links, obviously, to her plastic surgery.
Yeah, she's quite open that it came from just fundamentally not liking how she looked, trying to change the physical self to match some internal ideal.
Her descriptions of her body are just brutal, though.
There really are. Hate my body. Never been good. Even specific things like her thighs. She felt her body was constantly letting her down, betraying her, especially with aging. Things getting wobbly, looser. It sounds like a lifelong battle.
A really intense dislike.
So intense that the interviewer actually brings up body dysmorphic disorder because her perception, fat, seemed so at odds with how others saw her.
Right. It's not about diagnosing her from an interview, but it highlights how distorted her self-view might have been.
Exactly. And she says, no man ever complimented her body, ever called her beautiful, despite having, in her words, great relationships. That points to something really deep-seated, doesn't it?
Yeah, an insecurity that external validation just couldn't touch. What about affection growing up? Did that play a role?
She says there wasn't much physical affection, even though she believed her mother adored her. No hugging, that kind of thing.
And she saw that in herself, too.
Yeah, she admits she wasn't very physically demonstrative with Melissa either. She even describes this weird paradox, associating deep love with not touching, like not hugging goodbye.
That's fascinating, how early experiences shape even our physical expressions of love.
Definitely. And the interviewer makes another sharp observation about unspoken rules in her family. How might that have impacted her adult relationships, especially around that fidelity issue we talked about?
Ah, right. Because her boundaries seem so absolute.
Exactly. Perhaps partners just didn't get her specific rules because they weren't spoken. Her very strict definition of fidelity, no flirting, no lunches, seems likely rooted in her mother's formal values.
Which contrasts with her dad's attitude.
Yeah, he seemed more dismissive of that stuff. So these conflicting parental messages, these unspoken family rules, you can see how that could easily lead to confusion and hurt later on if partners had different assumptions.
Makes sense. Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways from this incredibly frank interview with Joan Rivers?
Well, first off, just sheer resilience, right? Facing immense loss, repeated betrayals, personal, professional, and somehow keeping going.
Yeah, that's undeniable.
And then seeing how powerfully those early family dynamics, that self-perception, shaped everything, especially the body image struggles, the relationship patterns.
And the humor. It feels so tied into all of that, doesn't it? Not just performance, but linked to insecurity, needing validation.
Absolutely. It's like the public persona and the private pain were totally intertwined. The very thing that made her famous also seemed to be her shields, her way of coping.
Yeah, a way to process it all, maybe deflect it sometimes.
Exactly.
Okay, so maybe a final thought for our listeners to chew on. Joan Rivers said, if I had a different body, I'd be a different person. Thinking about that, how much does our physical self really shape who we are, how we experience life?
That's a big question.
Right. Can you ever fully make peace with a body you feel has let you down? Or is that always going to be a tension you navigate? And maybe more importantly, what parts of ourselves can we redefine? What do we have the power to change, no matter what our physical form is?
A lot to think about there.
Definitely. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.